It's the week ending Saturday the 2nd of November, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK bracing itself for a December general election, the publishing of a report on the Grenfell Tower fire, and the beginning of Russia-backed Syria constitution talks in Geneva. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Holly Clements, from the Week Junior, Felicity Capon, and from Money Week, the man who thinks Nicola Sturgeon is the Nigel Farage of Scotland, it's John Stepek. And starting the show this week is Felicity. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this is the week we learnt that a single spark can start a prairie fire.
We are extremely saddened by the police force's use of excessive violence against the protesters and intentional assaults to civilians. We hereby again urge the HKSAR government to investigate the abuse of power by some members of the police force, and in particular, its response to the attack on civilians by suspected triads in Yunnan on June 21st.
Hong Kong protesters speaking at a press conference earlier in the year. Felicity, the situation over there rumbles on, of course, but you are actually keen to focus our attention on another international protest.
Yes, so this is the story from Chile, where a series of violent anti-government protests have unfolded in the last week, and some of them have been absolutely huge. In Santiago, the capital city, around about 1 million people have taken to the streets to rally against what the government and what they see as sort of gross inequality. It's the biggest protest for decades in the country, and Piñera, the president's response, he initially said the country was at war. He declared a state of emergency. He sent the troops out onto the streets, and this has brought back reminders of Pinochet's dictatorship.
And awful to say, but I actually had not seen this story. I was aware of the protests in Catalonia and Hong Kong and Lebanon. There are a lot going on. This one actually had passed me by. There are so many going on at the moment.
I mean, it is huge, and I think it has sort of slipped under the radar perhaps, but obviously it very much resonates with all these other protests that are going on the world, and that we've seen so many this year, whether it's Moscow, Algeria, Hong Kong, obviously, Catalonia. And so there's been lots of pieces, sort of people trying to work out how they're related and what the sort of uniting characteristics of them all.
With Chile specifically, what happened there to start these protests?
Similar to some of these other protests, it was actually something that was like seemingly quite small and quite minor. So it was a price rise in the cost of using the metro in Santiago, which is by standards on the continent very, very, very modern, very efficient. Millions of people use it, but the government decided to put up the price by about 30 pesos, which isn't huge. It's about 3.7% increase. But this was the catalyst for much bigger grievances, people airing their grievances over all sorts of things. And from an outsider's perspective, they see Chile as a sort of bastion of economic growth and stability, which it has been. But actually, if you look back, a lot of people who know Chile well will say this has been coming for decades. And actually, when you look at Chile's economic model, there is just so many problems, so much gross inequality, that this has ballooned into a much bigger issue.
And there's an obvious comparison there, John, isn't there, with the other protests? People sometimes term them as pocketbook protests. You know, it'll be a small thing that hits you in the wallet that causes you to hit the streets. And that can seem almost slightly demeaning. You know, why are you protesting about a small rise in a subway fare? But of course, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, it has happened in most of the other places as well. It's been similar. I mean, in France, the Gilets jaunes was kicked off by a hike in oil prices. Similar thing kind of happened in Lebanon. That was a tax on WhatsApp messages. And it's almost like, as you say, it is the kind of straw that breaks the camel's back. I mean, it isn't someone... I mean, the oil protests are slightly different because those do tend to make people kick off regardless. But something like I didn't actually realise it was only 3.7%, which is buttons. I mean, if commuter fares kind of every Christmas in Britain go up by a lot more than that. So, yeah, I mean, I think that economics is always going to be a factor in these things. It's other than that, it's always difficult to draw I think you have to be wary of drawing too many comparisons between them all, because obviously politics is always very local. But yeah, definitely, it's a lot of it usually comes down to money.
I mean, what we have in the West, though, Holly, is the ballot box, used in a more frequent style, as we're about to see coming up to Christmas, than you get in some of these other countries. So when John says, there isn't necessarily a comparable, yeah, commuter fares go up every Christmas, but then we have an election, and that's how you end up with Brexit, that's how you end up with Trump.
Yeah, although none of our elections seem to have reduced our train fares. Maybe that's what we need to be campaigning on. Screw Brexit, just train fares.
I think that might be Jeremy Corbyn's campaign slogan. We'll find out, won't we?
I think there's been lots of different styles of governance that people are protesting against. Like John says, it's really diverse. The Washington Post called it this week the year of the street protester, but they said it's exceptional from other years because of the breadth and diversity of all the different types of unrest. It also does look at quite a common factor, and that's young people rising up and using social media to kind of draw people together, which is quite an interesting aspect, especially in Chile.
Yeah, which is something that because this got talked about a lot in the Arab Spring, and then I guess became almost unfashionable to talk about kind of because of the Arab Spring. But I mean, that movement is still going on. People are using social media and apps and whatever to organise.
Yes, I think that is one of the characteristics that does unite a lot of these protests, that it is young people who are sort of taking the lead, taking the charge on this. And I think that's definitely the case in Chile, and that you're seeing it on social media, that the principles and aims, that's where you find them. It's hashtags, it's galvanising support online. And I think also in the case of Chile, maybe there is this talk of perhaps straight after Pinochet's dictatorship, there was actually a lot of fear and people wouldn't have taken to the streets so readily, whereas younger generations now are more fearless and are ready to protest. And I think some of them have been absolutely horrified and shocked by the level of violence that Piñera's henchmen have been sort of doling out. It is really pretty extreme. I think the other thing is that for the authorities, it's a massive challenge that because they are rising up on social media, there isn't really a leader, that it's a leaderless rebellion. It's very, very hard for the authorities to know who to negotiate, who to crack down upon. And even when a leader does emerge, sort of Joshua Wong in Hong Kong, for example, he was actually in jail when the Hong Kong protests broke out in June, and they carried on without him. And the same with Alexander Navalny in Moscow. They put him in prison pretty promptly, and yet the protests carried on without him. So it is quite difficult for authorities to know sort of where to begin with them. And I think their starting point has to go in really, really heavy with huge displays of violence and quite authoritarian behaviour. But whether they're actually getting anywhere with this, it's hard to tell. On the other hand, are the protesters themselves actually achieving their aims? A lot of the pieces I've read, it doesn't seem like they are going to necessarily get what they want.
Well, I've got a dubious statistic for you on that, more broadly, talking about the success of protests. 20 years ago, 70% of protests demanding systemic political change achieved it. Success rates now stand at 30%. Now, that's a study by Erica Chenoweth, who's a Harvard University political scientist. Does that feel right? Do we think protests aren't achieving what they used to?
I think maybe it's hard because it's hard to pinpoint what they're asking for, especially in Chile, this example. It starts off as one thing, but I wonder if that crackdown initially to draw out more people, older people, perhaps it started as students, but maybe other people came out because of the crackdown. And then they've got multiple reasons. So it would be quite hard to work out whether they've achieved those aims.
I think part of the problem, I suppose, is that the protests are multifarious. You have people all out together, but a lot of times they're campaigning for different things. Like someone could be on the streets about pensions. The students will be there in Chile, the extreme costs of university education. So yeah, there are very distinct aims sort of bringing people together, which is also really, really hard to know how to.
And that seems to be working against them. It's hard to know what you do as a leader, because I wouldn't be going around shooting people and to kill people, but also to stop, because there are elements that are criminal, people looting and setting fire to things and hurting other people.
And that is the case in Hong Kong as well, isn't it? It's the case everywhere.
Exactly, and how to split those people away from the people that are actually trying to peacefully find change. But then also from the protesters' point of view, if that is stopping you from achieving your aims because you've all got such multiple different goals, that's also a problem. So from both sides, it's kind of an impossible situation.
John?
I think what is fascinating is that there is this level of frustration here. And I always go back to this, but I tend to think that a lot of it does stem from the financial crisis and the kind of fallout from that. In a way, the financial crisis, maybe not in Chile and things like that, but there's this kind of element of people thought that the world was essentially getting better gradually under the kind of general tenets of globalisation, free markets, all that sort of stuff. And then 2008 happened, everything went pear-shaped, and the system that we had didn't really work, but nobody's kind of come forward with a system that feels as if it does work. And so if there's a kind of common thread, if you like, that kind of underpins all this, it's that sense of having the kind of established financial norms ripped out from under you and then not having anything to replace it. And I think that's an element, there's an element of that in Brexit, there's an element of that in the Catalan protests.
But in Chile, according to the World Bank, the number of people living at the poverty level, which is $5.50 per day, was 30% in 2000 and is now 6.4%, or it was in 2017. So actually standards of living in Chile have got better.
They are, but it's still, for Chile, it's still the inequality is staggering. Like, it really, really is astounding. And I think it's also the fact that so many of the political leaders, I mean, Piñera himself is a billionaire, are really, really out of touch with how hard, if you are, the middle class is being squeezed, but if you are poor in Chile, you are really, really poor. And they're just so out of touch. I mean, I think one of the ministers this week said with this increase on public transport, these people should just get up sooner if they want to avoid the price rise. And it's things like that. I mean, it's so hard if you live in one of the poorer areas outside of Santiago to get the bus to the metro, to get on the metro to come in. There's just a really complete understanding of how hard some people's lives are.
And you've lived in Chile for a while.
Yeah, I lived in Santiago for a year. Actually, my economics teacher was one of the Chicago boys who was actually with Pinochet, who set a lot of the kind of neoliberalism policies in place. And like the university where I was at, they sort of loved Pinochet. They thought he was great for the country. They thought that, they saved this country from Allende and communism and all this. So it's a really, really polarized society, definitely. But you definitely did see it. The rich were really, really rich and the poor, really had nothing. And I think it has now reached breaking point.
And it's often about that, isn't it, John, the discrepancy, rather than falling standards across the board. It's about the rich, even if they've lost a bit, are still much richer than the poor.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and again, that was a sort of function of 2008. I mean, I think Chile is fascinating because it was the kind of poster child of Latin America. It was the one that everyone pointed to as being the kind of the good economy in Latin America. And the fact that, as you say, poverty's gone down from 30% to 6.5% isn't really the relevant statistic in that kind of timeline. What's happened, certainly I feel, is that the way that we kind of rescued the global economy from the 2008 crash was basically to reflate the value of financial assets. Problem is, everyone that owns financial assets is rich, or certainly at that end of the scale. So they made a lot of money, but wages largely were repressed, partly by globalisation and partly just generally because the economy was weak. So I think that's the sort of fundamental driver of this gap between, if you like, the share of wealth going to owners of capital and the share of wealth going to people who have to use their labour to earn money. And I think this kind of is happening pretty much everywhere. And the thing is, by the time it starts to get better, weirdly enough, there's a kind of lagged effect. Like, people are getting annoyed about it now, even though there are signs, certainly in developed economies, that it's starting to improve and it's starting to turn around. So what we'll probably get is we'll get more radical kind of politicians and more radical policies, probably just at the time that we don't really need them anymore.
What do you think is going to happen to Piñera, Felicity?
He's already made some concessions. So the price hike in transport, he has rode back on that. He's fired his entire cabinet. So similar to Hong Kong, the sort of, you are seeing those in power sort of reversing what they've implemented in an attempt to kind of assuage these protesters.
But not actually stepping down themselves.
Not actually stepping down themselves, interestingly. And also, I think from people I've spoken to in Chile, they don't really have much hope that the new cabinet will be much the same as the old one, right wing, the same sort of thing. So I don't know, basically, but I think it will be very, very interesting. I think Chile's the one to watch.
Okay, John, you're up next after this. Okay, John, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is this the week that ordinary investors fell out of love with the masters of the universe?
So again, I'm extremely sorry that we've had to take this decision. We will keep our investors informed. We will use this time to reposition the fund in the way that we said. We understand our investors' frustration. All I can say in response to that, of course, is that this decision was motivated by your interests, our investors. When it is appropriate, we will open the fund so that you can buy and sell as normal.
Fund manager Neil Woodford apologising to his investors in a video back in the summer. John, what happened this week?
Okay, this week, or actually it was last week, but it was after we recorded the podcast.
I'll allow it.
Sorry, man. We got data released that shows that people are investing a lot more money in passive funds than in active funds.
OK. We'll park what passive and active funds are. First, remind us who Neil Woodford is.
Well, Neil Woodford was Britain's best-known fund manager, probably the only fund manager in Britain who actually had any kind of brand name recognition, and that your average person in the street might just have heard of him.
So was he like the David Beckham of Money Week? Could you put his name on the cover and you'd sell more?
Not quite. He's still not that famous.
Okay.
Warren Buffett is probably the only person who's the David Beckham of fund management. But certainly in terms of British investors, at least people would know who you were talking about.
And why did he have that reputation?
Well, basically because he was a great manager between 1988 and 2014. So basically a fund manager's job is to try to beat the market. So they pick stocks, and in this case, with Neil Woodford, he'd be trying to beat the FTSE 100, so the main UK stock market. Mm-hmm. And you know that he's done a good job if, over a long period of time, you make more money from him than if you had just stuck your money in something that copied the market performance.
So he had an unbroken record for a long time, but then it broke?
Yes, basically. So what happened was that because he got so famous, he split up with his fund management kind of company, which was a big fund management group, and he set up on his own. And what happened when he set up on his own was that his name attracted an awful lot of money to his funds, but he changed his strategy quite radically. And his strategy then started to involve picking very small companies as opposed to great big companies. And the main reason he ran into trouble was because A, a lot of the small companies didn't do very well, but B, it's very hard to get your money out of small companies in a hurry. And the problem with the way his fund was set up, and the reason it had to be suspended in June, is that he had all his money in the small companies. People had lost faith in his ability to make them more money. They started to pull their money out, and the problem was when they pulled their money out, he had to sell some of the stuff that he owned. And the problem is the stuff that he owned, he couldn't sell fast enough. It's as if you had to try and sell a tower block overnight. You wouldn't be able to do it. And so that's why he had to suspend the fund. Okay,
and then what happened this week is we learned that the public at large are turning away from that sort of fund manager.
Yes, exactly. So more money is flowing into passive funds, which just track the market, and away from active funds, which are run by basically human beings who are paid to try to beat the market.
Okay, and for most people listening to this who aren't investors as such, but probably have, a pension, if they have a fund manager for their pension, is that the same as having a non-passive investment, or is that a passive investment? The pension will say, we invest in Coca-Cola and, whoever.
So an active fund has got basically a human being who says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to pick different stocks and I'm going to try and pick the best stocks. And whenever I do that, that means that you're going to make more money if you give your money to me than if you just put it in a passive fund. Now, a passive fund just tracks the market. So, the FTSE 100, you hear it quoted every day in the news. So if it says the FTSE 100 went up by 5 points today, that means your passive fund, would also go up by 5 points. Okay. Whereas Neil Woodford would try to say, they got you 5 points, but I'm going to try and get you 10.
But charge you a lot more for the privilege, presumably.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's put this to the test. It's not a quiz, but Felicity, if you did have some money sloshing around, if I said to you for some reason, here's a dividend for all your excellent work on the Week Unwrapped podcast, here's 50 grand.
Oh, sounds great.
Yeah. I'm not making this a reality, I'm just saying. What would you do with that in terms of, if I said you have to invest it, would your first thought be to go to one of the big names who's going to say, I'm going to make you loads of money? Or would you think, I'm going to be safe and prudent? And if it is the latter, what does that say about where we are at the moment?
I would now think I would go safe and prudent, having read what I've read about Neil Woodford, there was a brilliant FT profile on him. And the details were just fantastic. It makes for really good reading, but I wouldn't put my money anywhere near him.
Give us a gossipy detail.
He lived in the former home of Formula One magnate Flavio Briatore in Buckinghamshire until 2014, but he fell out with his neighbours, including TV presenter Jeremy Paxman over his plans to build 28 stables and a dressage arena. He spent so much time on his horse. I think he remarried and his wife was very into horses. And he then spent so much time with his horses that the company brought in phones with special recording functions so he could make trading instructions while out riding.
There you go. You didn't know the FT had a sidebar of shame, did you?
But he also, it sounds like he also loved being able to get out his checkbook and say, I'm going to invest in this small company, and he loved that power.
But you're convinced that that sort of thing, if it's true, is representative of the kind of basically men who run these funds?
There's just something about this whole story that makes me want to stay away from the whole thing. I just don't.
Well, that's it, isn't it, John? I mean, okay, there's more passive investment, but could that just mean there's less investment generally because people are put off anything to do with the money market?
No, I mean, that is the worry. The worry is that people learn, if you like, the wrong lessons from this. You're right about Neil Woodford and his kind of crazy ego, and that is a brilliant FT piece. For example, you put money in a cold fusion company and you're like, well, that's kind of basically sci-fi. So no, just but anyway, the point is beating the market is hard. Like, one reason why we have markets is because it exploits the wisdom of crowds. So like thousands of people with their views aggregated will come to a more correct valuation of any asset than like one or two people doing it. So therefore, if you think you can beat the market, what you're arguing is that you're smarter than the wisdom of crowds. Now, sometimes you are, because, markets go wrong all the time. The point is that beating them is very difficult. What you really want to do is, if you do decide to invest in an active manager, you have to know what they're doing. A lot of people who invested with Woodford, I mean, if they'd actually realised what he was doing, and you could have found out, I mean, none of this was top secret. Lots of people were writing about it, and he'd major performance problems as far back as 2017. So if you'd been keeping on top of it, then you could have got out on time and probably with lots of money. But the point is, if you don't want to keep on top of it, then just invest with a passive fund, because all you're then doing is you stick your money in it every single month, you hold on to it for 20 years, and then hopefully you should have a lot more money at the end of that.
Well, Holly, this is the appeal of investing in property, isn't it, which we've talked about on the show before. There's a lot of laws to try and stop people getting second homes and all the rest of it at the moment, or disincentivise them, not stop them. But you can see why, if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to stay on top of all the detail, that sort of thing appeals. Like, generally speaking, everyone knows properties have gone up in value over the years, and therefore you do not have to contend with this kind of... Holly's distracted because John is mouthing, "Oh my God," and making a furious face at the moment. Let Holly have her say, John, then you can come back.
I'd also dispute whether properties are going up in price at the moment. Like, London is
sure,
not
but
so
as a
much.
general trend, if you held on to it for 20 years, that was the example John gave, you probably would get your money back at least.
I mean, potentially, you'd hope so. But then I guess, like John says, we all have this expectation of the world getting better and us all earning more money and houses going up. But maybe that won't be the case forever. But like Felicity says, I'd prefer to have my money in a safe place.
Right. So here you go, 50 grand. What are you doing with it?
Well, yeah, I don't think... I'm just not a gambler.
So
I
what
have it
are you
under my
doing
bed.
with it? There's only so many ISAs you can
in
have.
gold blocks. I guess there's also questions around like what the government's doing. Was the Financial Conduct Authority should have done more? Like, was the advertising in a proper way? Because the Panorama did a good documentary on it, and the people that are affected, it is really sad. It's their life savings, it's their pensions. It's not just really rich people that have invested and they've got the money to spare. It's people just watching their pensions kind of dwindle away. But in their defence, they just looked like they hadn't had the chance to kind of go through and look at all this research that you're talking about. But was that the fault of the website that he puts up? Like, was there something that the government or the authorities and watchdogs should have done to make sure that people don't kind of lose all their money?
Yeah, I mean, well, the tricky thing about Woodford is there's a lot of issues tangled up in this. I mean, the thing I would say about property, and sorry for mouthing.
Briefly.
All I'd say about property is that it's just another asset class like stock. If you hold stocks for 20 years, then in general stocks will go up too.
Okay.
So it's just levels of risk that you're taking.
But then it's about the safety of those stocks, isn't it? Which is why I mentioned Coca-Cola off the top of my head earlier. If you're investing in those sort of blue chip companies that basically aren't going to go away, it's different to one of these swaggering investors.
But the point is, but that's the point of passive investing. So if you invest in the market, if you invest in the index, so the FTSE 100 is Britain's top 100 biggest companies by market capitalisation, in other words, by value. If you invest in a passive fund, what you're doing is basically buying a small chunk of each of those 100 companies. So you're massively diversified, and if 2 of them go bust or 10 of them go bust or whatever, then it doesn't matter because you've got such a wide range of stocks there. And over time, stocks tend to return more than bonds, which is another asset class, or property in most countries, not the same in the UK actually.
If you noticed, like I do, Felicity, that John's saying lots of things, but he's not actually saying what he'd do.
Yeah.
What would I do?
It's true.
What
What do you do?
You're making it seems to me like you're making a case for passive investment.
Oh yeah, I am.
You are?
Passive investing is what you should do.
Okay, so it's
Sorry.
right
Yes.
that people have seen Woodford and said, I'm not touching that sort of thing.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough, you're being quite clear. All right.
Yeah, no, sorry. But I suppose what I'm trying to get to the point, though, is it's not because Neil Woodford was explicitly useless. It's that they're all pretty bad at the job. And that's not because they're necessarily idiots or even egotists. It's because beating the market is very, very difficult. And so some active managers do beat the market, but your chances as a a private investor, of finding the one that does, and it's maybe like 1 in 10, something like that, are very, very low. So you might as well go and invest passively in the market, and that means that at least you'll get the average return, which, weirdly enough, because everyone else is kind of using active managers, will be better than the average kind of private investor does.
And you can't really expect the general public to do such detailed research on the companies they are investing in, even if they're household names, because, the company in the UK may have an overseas owner that's lost a load of money in Spain, which you wouldn't even know about if you're just a sort of high street, consumer thinking, oh, they look like they're doing well.
Yeah, but I think, as John was saying earlier, it was all out there. I mean, it wasn't, I don't know, it just makes me feel nervous. I think you should have done some sort of research. I mean, he was everywhere and it just all sounded dodgy. I think you have to do some sort of research. But also things like he was playing down his investors' concerns. They were saying that the portfolio was hampered by Brexit uncertainty and a weakened UK economy, and Woodford was telling his clients that it would be fine once Britain left the EU and overseas money would flow into the UK and boost all the companies in his portfolio. So they were probably also being spun, I don't know, half-truths that weren't... I mean, who do you trust? The whole thing just gives me... Ugh.
To be fair, that was an opinion rather than
sure.
spin. And again, it's just that difference. It's like nobody can predict the future. And his portfolio might have been fine at some point. The real problem with his portfolio is that it was all in these really small companies.
I can predict the future, and that's that Holly is up next after this. And so, finally this week, it's Holly. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Has Russia got a new enemy?
My question to them would be, why are you not saying to every department, what's your digital by default plan? You've got to get there within 2 years, because otherwise, game over, because we're not going to be providing the services our citizens want. Look what's already has happened to this country. Look at how people in massive numbers are struggling with all kinds of areas of their lives, because we've wiped away services, because we're not managing to spend money as we should do. That's not a political point. I'm a crossbench peer. I have no politics in this. It's just about the absolute absence of vision about the modern world. Yeah. And to my mind, that is what they should be demanding. It's not about age. It's often said, oh, we don't have enough young people on your department. Maybe, but it's absolutely no excuse of any age not to realise, if you're leading a major government department, why this isn't the most important thing that you're facing in terms of how you're thinking about your resources.
Baroness Martha Lane Fox, the UK's former digital champion, speaking at an event for the Institute for Government last year. Holly, what's happened this week?
So from the UK to Russia, Financial Times have done an interview with Maxim Parshin, the Russia's Deputy Minister for Digital Development.
Did anyone else in the room know that name before today? Honesty poll? No. Okay, good. You're bringing us new people. Carry on.
He's very important.
I'm not saying he's not. I'm thanking you.
He is fighting against paper. They're the words he used, fight against paper. So the Russian government is basically trying to get rid of red tape, bureaucracy, and getting rid of paper in the government, which is something lots of different countries have tried to do, but it's kind of interesting when Russia's doing it and they're having a big digital push, especially if you look at their kind of history with how they treat their citizens, whether you want all those citizens to have all their personal data kind of at the hands of the Kremlin.
And what is the reaction in Russia to this?
You can look back at like the Orthodox Church was quite against the idea of paperless passports. They thought that would be a data issue. I guess we'll see what other kind of reactions there are. The Financial Times does point out all the kind of different holes that they could fall down doing this, and it just seems to have a lot of information in one place.
I mean, it's a particularly bureaucratic country, apparently, Russia, and that FT article that you sent me describes standing in queues with paper documents as a national pastime. So this is a big change.
Exactly, and even the interviewer says when he went in to speak to Maxim, he had to get loads of signatures on a written document, otherwise he wouldn't be allowed in the building. So I don't think it's an immediate change by the sounds of it. But yeah, it'd obviously be a big change for Russia, but also other countries, whether they want to compete with that, whether it kind of comes to the forefront. You'd heard there the UK view, maybe slightly slow. We're not trying to make everything paperless. You still get paper birth certificates, paper passports. It's still quite big around the world. Will this be the next new sort of fight between countries?
But weirdly as well, John, sometimes when a country has been behind in the digital revolution, they're able more easily to leapfrog their international competitors. I was on holiday in Bulgaria a couple of years ago, and I noticed that there was broadband internet everywhere, which isn't what I'd expected from Bulgaria. And I asked people who lived there why that was, and they basically said, well, we were a communist country. We didn't have dial-up internet. We didn't have to have the stage of everyone discovering 3G. We just went straight for the new stuff. And maybe Russia, weirdly, could be, the pinnacle of this kind of paperless future.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely could do it. And the leapfrogging stuff is, part of the reason you're able to leapfrog is because you don't have an entrenched kind of user group. And also, there's certainly in Eastern European countries and in Russia, the concerns about things like privacy and, authoritarianism and all that sort of stuff that we always get worried about.
Yeah.
They don't kind of ring quite as true. And it's also interesting, I mean, India, they basically banned cash at a certain level a couple of years ago, I think it was, as a way to try and tackle corruption. And I mean, it was very messy, and the jury's still out on whether it was a good thing or not. But that's something, you couldn't do that in Britain. At least certainly not kind of overnight, which is what they did. So yeah, a lot of it's also to do with the ability of governments to act in a quite an aggressive manner.
But Felicity, we will be doing it in Britain, won't we? Maybe not overnight, but within the next 50 years, everything will be digital, surely.
I think that certainly seems the way that it's going. It's things like passports, or the huge row over like how our passports would change over Brexit and that sort of thing. I wonder whether it would just be easier if more things were online and more things were digital. But I think that's the trend anyway. But I don't know. I think there's some things like a passport, which seems like, or a birth certificate, there is more nostalgia for them, and to have them in paper form seems to have more meaning somehow. They seem to have more, they just seem to be more meaningful items that you would want to hold and have a physical, tangible connection to in a way.
But also people trust them more, which is odd when you consider that paper documents can be more easily forged and can, burst into flames. People feel more secure when they know their birth certificate's a real birth certificate and it's in their filing cabinet in their home office. They feel more secure with that than trusting the government to hold a record of it.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it probably doesn't help that all the kind of hacking cases have happened over the years that it's clear that it might not be safe. I think there's also a practical element of, like you were talking about Eastern Europe, there's Estonia that is a sort of leading country when it comes to digital. Estonia.
Tell us about Estonia. I like
it.
They
do. They have e-citizenship, so you could get digital citizenship there if you're an entrepreneur and you wanted to have an EU company. They manage their health records on one platform. It allows them to vote online. So they do all sorts of things, and they're very much ahead of all the other countries around them. But they've also got a very small population. There's about 1 million, whereas Russia's like well over 140 million. So for a government as big as Moscow, I don't know if that would pose a much bigger challenge.
Voting's an interesting one, though, isn't it? Because it just
my ears pricked up then too.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think of in this country when I can't remember which constituency is the first one, and they rush with their paper ballot boxes, and it's always like who's going to be the, and it's really exciting. But secondly, it made me think of Bolivia and the controversy over Evo Morales' win, and the fact that that was online, and when the first results were coming in, they were head to head, and then the website which was officially counting them mysteriously went down for 24 hours, and by the time it had resurfaced, he was really ahead in the polls, and that's why you had all those protests there. So with voting, it seems a bit dodgy and must be open to manipulation by the government.
And also trusting nerds basically behind the scenes. You know, it's not even just about the integrity of the government, it's about the infallibility of the computer systems. And there's something about paper. You think back to hanging chads and all that stuff. That was tangible to the US population, wasn't it? A thing went wrong with some paper, so we'll look at the paper again. You know, whereas if it had been an algorithm, who are you trusting?
Yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, that is part of the thing with the whole, the move to digital. I mean, it almost goes back to the same thing as like Amazon and all the rest of it, though. I mean, it's the trade-off between convenience and security in a way, or at least even a sense of security. I mean, for example, I think it's great that when you get your driving licence now, you don't have to fill in loads of forms. You just have to send them a photograph and you can get that sorted out. Or when you're replacing your passport even, it's got a lot easier.
And you can take the photo at home now. Have you done that? Isn't that weird?
Aye.
Stand in front of a white background, look miserable, or you can do all that in your own home.
Spend ages retouching it up.
But then does it have implications for jobs, especially in Russia? Is it going to have a huge hit on all these people who rely on this bureaucracy and going through paperwork? I mean, they'll probably be like, so it might not be so.
You do wonder if there'll be a kind of computer says no problem there if you're, I don't know, an opposition member or a journalist or one of the many groups of people that the Kremlin doesn't really like, whether you'll show them some ID card and it will just be a case of no, you can't have whatever benefit you need or whatever you're after.
And John, you kind of slightly dismissed earlier the concerns of the West about corruption in the East as something that Russians would have a very different view on. I mean, maybe, but I mean, if we went back to 1948 and said to George Orwell, look, in 2019, you're going to be able to vote in Russia using a computer and the government will tell you who won, I don't think you'd be very impressed.
No, definitely not. You are right. One thing I would say, though, is that a paper bureaucracy can be a vast well of corruption, though, as well. And one of the reasons, for example, that the Indians kind of pushed through the demonetisation thing that they did was to try and crack down on essentially local councillors being corrupt and taking bribes for everything. And once you put... Because I guess this is the other thing, we kind of worry about the privacy aspects, but then there is also potential for much greater transparency if you're doing everything online. And to get rid of the kind of that phenomenon where you go to the desk and you get a nice guy that day, and then the next day you go to the desk and it's somebody that's in a right bad mood or somebody that wants a bribe. So I hate to say it, but it's just kind of there's swings and roundabouts here, and I think a lot of it probably depends on the overall tone of the governance in the country. This may be good.
That just made me think of NHS records. Only recently our doctors allowed us to look at it, and it seemed baffling that you spent all your life not seeing your own health records, and that was quite an eye-opener to me, but it did feel like a long time coming.
Yeah, actually we just had our second child, and when we wanted to see the records for the birth of our own first child, the hospital couldn't access them because the paper records had been shipped out to a warehouse and we had to wait a week to get them, and then they lost them. And you just think, that's just human error, isn't it? I mean, it should just be on a computer and you should be able to see it.
There's definitely pros and cons, and from an individual point of view, I think I'd rather see more digitisation, but I would worry for those governments that might use it for the wrong reasons.
Okay, Holly, thank you. And John, I understand that if people want to hear more from you, they can do so in person, glory be.
Lucky them. Yes, November 22nd in London, Money Week is holding its annual Wealth Summit. And actually, rather than me, you'll get to hear from genuinely interesting people like Russell Napier, Gillian Tett from the FT, my own colleague and boss mayor in Somerset Webb. Dame Helena Morrissey is talking about ESG.
All-star cast.
Yeah, there's loads of great people, so please come along. moneyweekwealthsummit.co.uk.
And will you be there if people want to just chat to you at the bar? Get a
I will
cheeky
be
selfie?
there.
Yeah?
You can grab me later. Talk to me about Nicola Sturgeon.
You don't know what you're inviting. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to John Stepek and Holly Clements and Felicity Capon. Speaking of storing your valuable data online, do discover our entire back catalogue when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. Just search for, guess what, The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sarah Miles at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.